Let's get some analysis now from Father Frank Brennan, Jesuit priest and human rights lawyer. He's also the rector at Newman College at the University of Melbourne. Father Frank, thanks for your time. What do you think of the federal government's response in the wake of this calamity in Afghanistan?
Well, I think it has to be broken down into three separate issues, Kieran. The first, of course, is evacuation of people from Afghanistan, given the collapse of the situation there. And I think we should give praise to all Australian officials who are there in harm's way, doing their best to get out those who are Australian citizens, those who have visas, and those who have worked for the Australians. So that's one issue. The second issue is, once that job is done, what are we going to do as a nation, having committed our troops there for 20 years? What are we going to do in relation to our responsibility, our moral responsibility, our international responsibility, to those who will flow across the border, particularly into Pakistan and Iran, and who will be seeking refuge elsewhere? Now, there are already 1.4 million Afghans in Pakistan who are seeking that refuge. Now, I think we as Australians need to do our bit, and I'm one of those Australians who think our bit sounds more like 20,000 rather than 3,000. A third and discrete issue is then, what should we do with the residual caseload of Afghans now living amongst us here in Australia, about 5,000 of them, who were put on temporary protection visas. Now, as your listeners will know, those visas were resurrected by Mr Morrison in 2014 when he was Minister for Immigration, and it was on the basis that these people came by boat and really we wanted them to go back where they came from. Well, everyone now knows they can't possibly go back to Afghanistan. Some of them have now been living here for over 10 years. Now, back in 2014, Mr Morrison had to cut a deal with Clive Palmer, of all people, to get his legislation through the Senate, where he set up what was called the Safe Haven Enterprise Visa, which allowed some of those on temporary visas to get those visas if they lived and worked in country areas. Now, as you know, just this week, we've got a new farm workers visa being set up. So I think we should move to giving permanent residence to those 5,000 so they can start to sponsor their families, and then we can sponsor 20,000 places for those who are stranded in Pakistan or Iran.
So that point you make there, they're not only in a situation of limbo because they're not going back to Afghanistan, obviously, under TPVs. They can stay here, but that follow-up point that you made there at the conclusion of your answer, they're also unable to sponsor family members, aren't they, under the TPV arrangements?
Yes, which is one of the truly shocking community factors to take into account now, that we have 5,000 Afghans living here in our midst, being perfectly responsible citizens, being ably employed, getting education. They're the very ones we would be looking to say, well, look, we can't take all of those Afghans who are fleeing persecution under the Taliban, but sensibly we should be taking those who have already got good family connections to those who are here. And just imagine the hell that we're going to put those 5,000 through living in our midst when everyone accepts they can never go back to Afghanistan. Isn't it time that they were given permanent residence here in Australia? And the other point to make is this, Kieran. Let's not forget that even the Morrison government used to have 18,750 places a year for humanitarian cases. Now that got cut by 5,000 back to 13,000 when COVID cut in. So to say that we'll just take 3,000 in the first place as a floor, not a ceiling, and that's part of the 13,000, we need to get back to a decent intake, taking into account what has now happened in Afghanistan.
Now, are you concerned that with a federal election on the horizon, that border protection politics will hinder a more compassionate response, as you're advocating for?
Federal elections are always difficult in this context, but on this occasion I do take heart from this. I think the sense of the Australian community is that for Afghans who have been living in our midst for over 10 years, I think there's going to be a sense of saying, look, we can do the right thing by them. Let's remember, that we already have in place the turn-back policy, and it's not like 2012 when Angus Houston said he couldn't recommend turnbacks because they weren't safe or legal. Well, this government says they're safe and legal and they're in place. Well, if you've got turnbacks, I think there are enough people in the Australian community who say, well, hang on, if they're here, they've been here over 10 years, let's give them permanent residence. And I think the good thing on this occasion is the Labor Party has a clear policy difference from the coalition, which is to say, give them permanent residence. So let's get that nailed down, and then let's look in terms of electoral politics, what's the Australian community prepared to do, given that we committed our forces to Afghanistan for 20 years? I think we're prepared to do much more than just give 3,000 in the first instance. So I don't have the same fears this time about it playing into the electoral mode, and I would think that Mr Morrison will have the sense over time, at least I would hope, as our national leader and now 3 years Prime Minister, to say, yes, I've read the sense of the Australian community, and there are lots of people, including our veterans, who know these Afghans, want us to see more. We can do much better than 3,000. Bear in mind, Kieran, even a country like Uganda, which has over 1 million refugees, they put their hand up immediately and said to the United States, yeah, we'll take 2,000 or 3,000 now until you can find a place for them. Well, I think given our commitment to Afghanistan, the Australian public will want much more.
Father Frank Brennan, I appreciate your time and your insights as always.
Pleasure, good to be with you. And here's hoping that something can be done, particularly for those here in Australia.